once you've spoken to Mr. Arar on his own, not when there are people in the room who held him illegally for 10 months. You can't expect the truth to come out of such circumstances. Everybody knows that. I'll continue now. When Mr. Arar was released on October 5, 2003, he flew back to Canada with the Canadian consul. He gave the consul some details about his ordeal, stating that he had been beaten on occasion during the first 2 weeks of his detention. The consul reported his conversations to other officials at the department a few days later. However, subsequently, in memoranda, he reported that Mr. Arar had said that he had not been beaten. No mention was made of the statements Mr. Arar had made on the plane trip back to Canada. Mr. Arar spoke publicly of what had happened to him in early November 2003. He described how he had been beaten during the first 2 weeks of his imprisonment and had given the Syrians a statement. Although somewhat more detailed, the description was consistent with what he had said on the plane. Professor Toop found Mr. Arar's description completely credible. In the months following Mr. Arar's release, there were a number of leaks from unnamed government sources, indicating that Mr. Arar had admitted to having terrorist links in Syria and stating that he was not and I quote, a nice guy or a quote-unquote virgin, as would be seen when the truth came out. It is fair to assume that some government officials and members of the public had the impression that Mr. Arar had admitted to having connections to terrorist activities, and they formed a negative impression of him. If nothing else, some assumed that where there is smoke, there is fire. We've been hearing something similar in this room. Certainly, at the beginning of the inquiry, it was obvious to me that many within government believed that Mr. Arar had not been tortured, and that he had voluntarily admitted links to terrorist activity to the Syrians. They were of the view that the truth would come out during the inquiry. And I'm quoting here. Well, the truth did come out. When Professor Toop's report was made public over a year later, the government did not challenge the findings in the report, and indeed, through counsel, the government indicated that Mr. Arar had given a credible account that he was tortured. The disturbing part of all of this, and again I'm quoting, is that it took a public inquiry to set the record straight. Getting it right in the first place should not have been difficult, and it should not have been a problem to keep the record accurate. However, over time, the misperception grew, and seemed to become more entrenched as it was reported. In the report, says Justice O'Connor, I speak often of the need for accuracy and precision when collecting, recording, and sharing information. Inaccurate information can have grossly unfair consequences for individuals, and the more often it is repeated, the more credibility it seems to assume. We have before us partial allegations that are incomplete, that experts are denying. But there are some at this table, some of my colleagues, that insist on repeating this information that has not been proven. According to officials, this information is not true. And yet, they're continuing to repeat it. And to Canadians, as the judge said, more the information is repeated, more it will be believed. That's very important. Inaccurate information is particularly dangerous in connection with terrorism investigations in the post-9/11 environment. Officials and the public are understandably concerned about the threats of terrorism. However, it is essential that those responsible for collecting, recording, and sharing information be aware of the potentially devastating consequences of not getting it right. Madam Chair, this burden weighs not only on our intelligence services. Yes, that is a significant burden for them, but it is a burden that we all have to bear. It is something that we all have to bear. We are elected officials. We have privileges that anything that we say here in Parliament, well, we can say whatever we want, and we won't be held accountable for what we say, because we have the freedom to speak, and it's important for being a good parliamentarian at the House or at the Senate. And, Madam Chair, with this responsibility, or rather, with these privileges, comes responsibility. And what really angers me is the fact that the people who are responsible, the people who have a more exhaustive understanding than we do, they came to the conclusion that Yes, there's always foreign interference in Canada. But the allegations that we're reading about in newspapers are not true. They're not credible. And they're going to mislead Canadians. If we want to question these people, then we're all lost. Because these people have experience. They are devoted to protecting all of us. They've learned from the past. They do their work. They work hard. They have sources of information that comes from our allies, the United States, Great Britain, or rather the UK, Australia, New Zealand, the Five Eyes. And they probably have other sources of information. I don't want to invent anything. I don't want to share information that might not be entirely true. But they have access to this information. We can say that. And they came here, and without sharing information that would be detrimental to national security, they answered our questions truthfully, and they concluded that the things that were stated in the newspapers were not true. So why are we continuing to push this? Why are we trying to break parliamentary traditions for this? Why are we accusing some people of being under foreign influence? How is it that we find that acceptable to say this about a prime minister? It doesn't make sense. Everything's been flipped upside down. Madam Chair, I know that there is one government at fault, the Chinese government, and other authoritarian countries like Russia or Iran. They're watching us as we rip our shirts. Some are insisting on repeating lies. Some have good motivations but are still playing this game, maybe for noble reasons, but their reasoning is wrong, as has been confirmed by those who are responsible for our safety and our security. I really don't understand how we're continuing to repeat things that are undermining Canadians' trust in our institutions. Even when experts tell us that our institutions up till now have resisted the efforts of foreign actors. And, Madam Chair, that doesn't mean that we can rest on our laurels. we always have to stay vigilant. We need to adapt our measures in order to respond to these countries that are trying to create chaos in democracies around the world. I'm not sure if it's Ms. Vanderbilt who said that the real issues today are not capitalism versus communism. It's authoritarian governments versus democratic governments. It's Ms. Vanderbilt who said this with her experience where she worked in developing countries and she saw what happens in an authoritarian system. Where there are some who work in those countries and try to establish a good government, to have something like what we have here in Canada. They need help. And I hope that we'll always be there to help them. She saw with her own eyes and spoke of the importance of best practices being adapted. And Madam Chair, Ms. Vandenbelt mentioned this morning how Canada is perceived as a leader on these issues, global leaders.
She talked about her experience, the beginnings of how it is possible to democratize as much as possible the responsibilities, international security. Oh, I touched the mic, I'm sorry. To share responsibility for issues concerning national security, international security. And it started with a proposal by former Prime Minister Paul Martin to establish a committee on national security. He tried to create this through support in Parliament to involve parliamentarians so that they could swear an oath as members of the Privy Council in order to be able to have access to national security information secrets. Unfortunately, he lost the majority government that they had, and the Liberals formed a minority government, and then the next election was lost. Then we had a prime minister that claimed at the time to be very strong when it came to national security issues, But in fact, he never followed up on that good idea. He never put in place a committee, an advisory committee, to look into national security issues. It was only in 2015, after the election of majority Liberal government under Prime Minister Trudeau, that this Committee on National Security was actually created. We call it NCCOP in English. Not only did the government create that committee that was so much desired, but the government also created an oversight body in CIRA, it's called. And this is a different committee. It is made up of officials who are responsible, have responsibilities for national security issues and protection in Canada, but also it is a body that includes the recognized political parties in the House with campaign directors and others who have sworn an oath, and they too have access to information about major threats or major efforts by foreign powers to interfere in our institutions or in our elections. Madam Chair, this was another important innovation. As my colleague, the member for Kingston and the Islands, demonstrated today through his comments, the national campaign chair for the Conservatives in 2021, Mr. Laurie, he said that there was no doubt in his mind that the election was not threatened by foreign interference. The result of the election, whether we're talking about the national result or the result of each riding, reflected the will of Canadians. He also said that the debate that I find myself in, and Canadians are watching us tonight here, he came to the conclusion that unfortunately his political party was playing politics, and it is unfortunate because this is a national security issue. He is not alone. He is not the only conservative and well-known conservative to say that NCCOP should be the ones looking into this. Mr. Laurie said further that after the Prime Minister's announcement last Monday, he said that the Prime Minister had gone further than what he would have recommended himself, and that it would be important to take this opportunity to look into these matters outside the bounds of partisan interests. I think that Mr. Laurie was reflecting the will of most Canadians. Removing these issues from a partisan forum was an important thing to do. So I'm very pleased to see that was the case and that there is an agreement here. People are nodding around the table. I'm encouraged by that. I'm really encouraged because maybe we will find a way to get out of this impasse that we're in. But I said, Mr. Delory was not the only conservative to say these things. We had a former assistant, RCMP assistant, a former chief of the Ottawa Police Service, Senator White. I have had the pleasure of having a number of conversations with him about the future of Wellington Street, not only our desire to make Wellington into a sort of plaza that would be more pleasant, more interesting for Canadians, so that they have a place to come and celebrate, but also sometimes to come and protest. Mr. White had looked in depth into issues relating to security on Parliament Hill. And he and I agreed that government and our institutions were being unreasonably exposed to risks. We need to protect our parliamentary precinct. I don't want to talk about this much longer because it's really not relevant to our debate, but I just want to say in this regard that Mr. White, former Senator Vern White, was someone who was motivated by the national interest, and we were able to get beyond partisan interest to talk about the real issues. I consider him a friend. I heard him say on television, rather on the radio, on the weekend. It was on the program on CBC in English. It's called The House. He said in a very frank manner that it was hogwash, and that would be the politest way to put it. It was hogwash to say that NCCOP was not the best place to look into these matters. Because in that forum, parliamentarians can have access to information, to all of the information. It's a committee that already exists. And it is completely free. It does not come under the Prime Minister of the day, does not come under his control. It is completely independent of the Prime Minister. He was part of that committee, and he said that it did very important work looking at overall security issues. There are no leaks that come out of that committee. The current members and former members, without exception, took their work very seriously. And they don't deserve to be insulted by some people that consider NCCOP to be a forum that is influenced or controlled by the Prime Minister and under his will. So, Madam Chair, it is so important that we continue to support NCCOP in its work. I can tell you, Madam Chair, that we have to avoid tarnishing the reputation of those that sit on that committee because, like Mr. Delory, Mr. White, we have come to the conclusion that these are two very important tools that we can use to get to the bottom of these issues without incurring huge costs that would be borne by Canadians. And I think that those are at least two very well-known conservative to have said this. Now, my colleague, the member for Kingston and the Islands, mentioned a third conservative, former Senator Hugh Segal. Once again, he is a great Canadian with a very important background. He was a former member of the PCO. He worked with former Ontario Premier Bill Davis. I come from Quebec, but I remember that Premier Bill Davis was always considered one of the best premiers. He, too, Mr. Segal, indicated in an opinion piece in the Toronto Star that was just published that he came to the same conclusions as Mr. White, Mr. Delory as well, the former Conservative campaign director. He said NCCOP is where these matters should be dealt with. That is what the Prime Minister proposed, and this is what should be done. We have to stop playing petty politics concerning such an important issue. Madam Chair, there is no doubt. There really is no doubt at all that this is the case. And Madam Chair, I would like to continue, but I know that there are other members that wish to speak, and I would really like to hear from my colleagues, especially those in the opposition. I hope they won't just keep saying the same thing. That is, we've been talking about this for hours. This is an important issue, and we have to take the time that is needed to really discuss these issues, period. So if they have new arguments, new comments to make, I certainly will be listening. But I hope that they will stop repeating the same old refrain. I hope that they will listen to me, as I intend to listen to them, and I hope they will consider the reasons that I have given for respecting our traditions here in Parliament, that we should end this debate, withdraw the motion, and allow the committee that has a mandate to look into these issues. And what the committee can do publicly, it will do, but what it needs to study in camera, it will do that way in order to protect our national security interests. They should be allowed to make the report, and then we can all know. So thank you, Madam Chair. I will now listen to what others have to say.
Mr. Fergus.
Thank you, Mr. Fergus.
I'm going to go to Mrs. Blaney, and then before I go to Mr. Barrett, I am going to give us a quick break, a quick health break, and then we'll resume with Mr. Barrett. Mrs. Blaney, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Chair, and I hope that the sound is good. I know that I was gone for a short period of time, so you'll let me know if the interpreters have any concerns, because I definitely want to make sure they're supported. Madam Chair, this is a serious issue, and I don't take any of this lightly. We are talking about how elections are done in our country and the impact of foreign interference, and that is incredibly serious. And I take that very seriously as I move forward in these discussions. I do want to say that when I look at Mr. Turnbull's amendment, I have no problem with it if it's added to the content that we have already in the motion. So I just don't see it replacing. I don't think it's appropriate. You know, there's a long history of the NDP, and I've heard many of my Liberal friends remind us of that, of not pulling in staff. Unfortunately, we're in a situation where this keeps coming out in the media, and it is impacting constituents and Canadians. And I was really surprised to listen to an earlier member from the Liberal benches today talk about that it's no big deal and that no one in his riding is contacting him. Well, I don't know his riding. He knows his riding better than I do. But I can assure him that I am not here because I enjoy being away from my constituents when I should be with my constituents. I'm here because my constituents have contacted my office enough for me to understand that they are experiencing some serious concerns around our democratic institutions, and we need to take that seriously. That, to me, is the very point of this. This is why we've been calling for a public inquiry. This is why we've been saying repeatedly it must be a process that is transparent, that it's public, and that it's independent. Because we've now gotten to a point where all people hear is the Liberals justifying, instead of us just saying, okay, we're now at a point where we have to have a public process because Canadians are getting concerned. And those institutions fundamentally matter. I too trust our institutions. I agree that they could be stronger and better. This is why a public inquiry is so important to the NDP. And I think it's very concerning that the Liberals have been pushing back against a public inquiry, suggesting that it's unable to deal with secret information. We know that's not the case. We've seen that happen before. It can happen again. And I'm also very concerned. I heard MP Sahota, when she was here the other day, dismissing them because they cost a lot of money. Again, that's really concerning to me. It isn't about us as politicians. It's about Canadians in this country having faith in our systems. So when she compared it to the LRT inquiry, suggesting that it wasn't worth the cost, I'm not sure that people from Ottawa would share that opinion. So I just, I want to bring these forward. This is concerning to me. This is a position right here in this committee where we are very partisan. That's the truth of politics. That's why we're asking for it to be in a venue that isn't partisan, that really takes Canadians' concerns seriously and lets us know what's happening. That's it. It's a transparent process. And I just want to point out that I've been listening to Mr. Fergus, my friend Mr. Fergus, speak for over an hour and a half, I believe, about the Arar Commission and how that investigated intelligence leaks and misleading leaks from government sources, who I just think is important to note, and I think he noted it as well, was a Liberal government at the time. I agreed that we got a lot out of that report. And I think this is the part that I find most perplexing, is that this is an excellent example of how relying on a public inquiry to get to the bottom of things, to get information out, for the public to have faith in that. It's like watching the member argue for what we're asking for. So I'm not sure why that is not happening. There's a really great opportunity. It sounds like he's calling for a public inquiry. I support that. So hopefully we can get some actions done. But I also just want to come back for a moment, just on a personal note. We saw something happen today where we had a member raising their voice. And I just want to recognize that it was dealt with. And I appreciate the apology that was made. But one of the things that is sticking with me is the difference between intention and impact. And that when we're talking about these decisions that we make, we must be always focusing not on our intention, but on the impact. So when I talk about a public inquiry, to me, that's about what will be the good impact. I hear from the Liberals that they have great intentions. They feel that they've done a great job to deal with these issues. And I respect fulsomely all of the members on NSICOP. But the impact of what's happened in this country is that more Canadians are not trusting their public institutions. So I just want to remind everyone that we need to focus not on our intentions, but on the impacts of the things that we do and the actions that we take. And I also heard, I was referenced about the importance of spending time in a constituency week with our constituents, and I couldn't agree more. I've had to move a lot of things to accommodate this day. And I do it because I take my job very seriously, as I know everyone around this table takes their job very seriously. And, I don't want to miss time with my constituents. In fact, I was thinking of Miss Ramanado yesterday when I was in Gold River, where I was talking to the fire chief of Gold River and of Tassis, and was very disheartened to hear from the fire chief from Tassis that they have no space to deal with their contaminated suits, that their building was condemned and now everything is in a CCAN. So when they do anything, they have to think about it very carefully, because if they get any kind of moisture on their suits, how they're going to dry those are particularly hard because they don't have the proper infrastructure. So when I think of the work that we're doing today and the fact that we are sacrificing precious time with our constituents, I think everybody in this room needs to honor it. And I honor it especially because there are volunteers in my riding who will run to the fire and save people's lives and save people's houses the best that they can, and they don't even have a right place to decontaminate their suits. That is wrong in this country. It's shameful in this country, and there's a lot of work to be done here. I also just want to say that when we see something come forward that is public, independent, and transparent, I will be very happy to move quickly. I appreciate that a special rapporteur, and I agree that is something that's used all over the planet. It's a role that's very specific. I think most Canadians know what that is because Canadians are intelligent. I appreciate that, but it is a baby step. It is a baby step on an issue that is front of mind to far too many Canadians. And I want to see this taken out of this partisan place. I don't want to see this issue used to make political wins. And I am seeing the parties that are using it to make political wins. And I worry about that. I worry about how it's being used to create more fear. I don't like that. I don't do that easily. I never do that personally. So I want us to get to a place where we can vote on this and move forward. Because I just, I really listen to what Canadians are saying. I see what's in the media, and we need to remember, if we do not have these issues dealt with in a way that Canadians have faith in the process, it just will become increasingly partisan. So I'm asking everyone, please, to work together to try to get to some sort of solution. Let's go to the vote. Let's get to work for Canadians, and hopefully we'll see something happen quickly around a public inquiry. I think we can all agree that Canadians deserve answers. This is the clearest way forward, in my opinion, and I think numerous opinions have come out supporting that. And of course, our leader, Jagmeet Singh, has been very clear repeatedly in the House of Commons that this needs to happen. So let's work together. Let's get to work around the boundary redistribution. I am also concerned. I have members in my own party, and I've heard from other members who have put forward concerns, and they want to be talking to the committee about getting that work done. I think we need to focus on that work, but we're stuck here. We're stuck here because the Prime Minister won't call a public inquiry. Simple. So I hope you guys figure something out. I hope that all of us remember that our impact is way more important than our intention, and work for Canadians. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm happy to release the floor to the next speaker.
Thank you, Mrs. Blaney. And with that, I'm going to suspend for, I'm going to say 10 minutes because